Hello and welcome to I Miss Book Club. I'm Veronica Reynolds and I'm here
Hello.
with co-host Dana Munch. Good morning, Dana.
Morning.
So we have another chapters book to discuss this week. Today we're talking about Once There Were Wolves by Charlotte McConaghy. She's an Australian writer. She lives in Sydney, but this is her sophomore novel. Her first novel was called Migration, but obviously she has a nature theme going on. She's a conservation-minded writer. So why don't you tell us a little bit about the book?
Sure. So we met yesterday, so it's very fresh in my mind. This book is very interesting. Like you said, it's very interested in sort of nature and ecosystems and things like that. And so this book is about this woman named Indy Flynn, and she is a biologist, and she is also a twin, which is an important factor in the story. She and her twin are extremely close, and Indy moves to Scotland with her sister with basically trying to reintroduce gray wolves back into Scotland. Now, her sister Aggie is not involved in this at all. She just kind of lives with Indy, and because of a traumatic experience, she needs a lot of care. So Indy takes care of her, and at the same time, she's reintroducing these wolves. While she is there, a local man is found dead or goes missing and presumed dead. And the issue is that the local townspeople are not very thrilled about these wolves being introduced because they are all farmers and have a lot of livestock. And so they are worried about the safety of their livestock, which is therefore the safety of their way of life and their income and sustaining themselves as a community. Right. So she is very, convinced that this was not a wolf that killed him, but it sets forth this chain of events trying to figure out who did it, how this happened, was it a wolf, was it not a wolf, and like mitigating the opinions of the townsfolk on this whole task that they're doing there. And that's kind of the crux of the book.
Which is interesting because it makes it sound to me like a mystery, but it doesn't seem like any of the reviews qualify it as a mystery.
Yes, I totally agree. So when I read when I read the reviews about this, I did not get the sense of it being a mystery at all, but it absolutely is a mystery, which was very fun because Chapters doesn't really read a lot of mysteries. We have, but it absolutely is. There's a lot of whodunit. There's a lot of like twists and turns and detail reveals that change your whole perception about what is happening and who is really who they seem and who is not. It's very interesting.
Because you mentioned the twin, and what came up in a lot of the reviews is that the twin used to be this very vibrant person, Aggie, right? I think is the character's name.
Yes.
You feel like extremely vibrant and lively, and is no longer like that, as almost like a semi-catatonic, which is part of the mystery that's kept from the reader, if not from the main character.
Yes, and also there is a detail where Indy, the main character, has what's called mirror touch synesthesia, which is a condition where basically anything that she sees, she can feel. So if someone else is getting hurt, she feels as if that pain is happening to her, like, in extreme detail, and it's overwhelming and it totally affects her way of life. And at the same time, like you said, her sister Aggie is sort of recovering from a traumatic experience, and like she is some days able to communicate and some days is totally catatonic.
So just to clarify, because I don't know that everyone knows what synesthesia is, it's the crossing of two senses usually, like you can taste numbers or see music. And Charlotte McConaghy says that she is someone who has synthesia, not mirror touch, but she has, I have it in the interview, this interview I found, her memory only works by linking words, numbers, or sounds to color, shape, and texture. So she doesn't say exactly how her synthesia manifests beyond that. And she said when she first learned about mirror touch, it's such an extraordinary condition, I couldn't stop thinking about it and how it creates the most extreme form of empathy a human can experience. I don't know that mirror touch. I didn't know mirror touch was real, but she's claiming that it is.
Yeah. I
It's
had never heard of it either, but it does play a huge role in the book. She obviously, as a biologist, has like a very strong bond with like forests and animals and this sort of thing. Of note, their father is like someone who was like this also, and so they were raised kind of in the woods. Um, but I think having this condition makes it even more immediate for her, because she, there are details where she's like watching a wolf eat an animal that it caught, and she can like feel the teeth and feel the fur and feel the meat, and like so she is like kind of like the wolf and the elk at the same time. So it's a very interesting detail in the story.
It sounds like she chose a really interesting career path for somebody who had that particular issue.
Yeah, very true. Um, you know, in our book club last night, we sort of talked about her emotional enmeshment with these wolves. And I think that this condition does not necessarily help the downsides of that.
Yeah, I'll bet. So what were some of the themes that came up in book club last night? What did you guys touch on?
So a lot of the time we spent talking about domestic violence, actually, which I think is something to note about this book. There's a lot of violence in it generally, which I did not really get from the reviews. But domestic violence in particular plays a pretty large role. And obviously there are like murders and maimings and other things happening with like, the townsfolk. But we talked a lot about that. We also talked about the relationship that Indy has with her twin, and about twins who are like very bonded. This pair in particular is extremely bonded. They've basically never been without one another. And so we talked about like the pros and cons of that. Like always having someone that understands you and is in your corner, but at the same time, you almost become isolated from other people because you don't really need anybody else. And then we talked a lot about like who we thought like had done the killing, and like all of those things that are involved with the mystery.
Yeah, I mean, how was that for your group that doesn't usually do mysteries to talk about a mystery? Did they think it was a mystery, or were they interested in that part of the book?
Yeah, I think we all were sort of taken by surprise by it, but it's very like interwoven in the bigger story about these wolves and the clash between the biologists and the townsfolk. So it's sort of like a secondary storyline almost, even though it's very important for the story. But I think we were all kind of pleasantly surprised by it. It also presents, like I said, a lot of twists and turns, which makes it fun. I read this book in like a 4-hour chunk of just being totally absorbed by it, which doesn't normally happen for me. Like I always enjoy reading, but I usually get to a point where I'm like, I need to rest my eyes, I need to get up. And I just had no sense of wanting to do that because I was so interested in everything that was happening.
Do you think you would go back and read her first book because of that?
Yes, absolutely. I immediately added it to my to be read pile, which is, towering. But
I was gonna say, how extensive is that pile? Because so we could
Yeah.
talk about it in like 2-3 years, right? We'll get to that.
Yeah, I would love to read it.
Because that one I think was also had a conservation end, except around birds, it looked like. And it sounds like McConaughey really bases stuff a lot on how she travels, which I think is interesting. She had lived in, I think she said she lived in Ireland for a year. She's obviously not Scotland, but she must have traveled between, and she spent a lot of time in Iceland, which I think where the first book is set.
Yeah. I will say also the writing was excellent. I really enjoyed the writing style.
Yeah, echoing back
to kind of call back to our 4 doorways from last time.
It sounds like this one's like language, plot, and character. You got like a good.
Yeah, it really was good. I really enjoyed it.
One of the things that she was asked a lot about in interviews was like writing from the perspective of people who didn't want the wolves reintroduced, because obviously she's a very conservationist minded person. Did you find that those characters were fully fleshed out, or did they feel kind of like straw men?
They were sort of just like obstacles a little bit. Like, I don't think that we really got a full sense of what they were concerned about. The way that it's presented is just like the town generally is not happy about this. And there's a couple of scenes where there are like meetings or town hall type scenarios where they kind of clash. But in each of those scenes, basically someone from the biology team sort of intervenes to like tell their side of it. So I do think that it was a little bit steamrolled, but you absolutely get the sense, I think the basic kernel of it is we need our livestock to make a living. And without that, our entire way of life is kind of undermined. And really, that's like what you need to know to understand the tension there.
Yeah, I just thought it was interesting because like they asked her so pointedly about it, and she's like, "Oh yeah, I talked to a lot of farmers," and this isn't to knock the author. I just think it's
Yeah.
interesting because obviously she has an agenda with her writing. I mean, she's not shy about saying that. And they were asking her like, "How did you like research this point of view?" And she did talk to people, but I imagine it's really hard when you have like a very strict idea of what should be done to write compassionately about people who are on the other side of that fence. I think that's a real feat if you can manage it. So I was wondering how in depth she got with it, or she kind of decided to skirt it to avoid having to go too deep.
Yeah, I don't think we really learned too much about any of those characters. There's like one person in particular that is introduced way at the beginning as sort of someone who's very angry with her. And they have, like that relationship between Inti and that particular man is like sort of see them connect again and again over the course of the book. And it changes in certain ways. And I think they come to more of an understanding at some point. But like I said, they're more just like these presented as like these obstacles to what she's really trying to do. And so I don't feel like you really got their whole side of it.
Yeah, that makes sense. I thought this was interesting too. Someone was asking if her writing had always been focused on animals in the natural world. And she said, I grew up wanting to write as escapism, as fantasy, as a way to have adventures without leaving the safety of my bedroom, which feels very familiar. I feel like I've read that in a million interviews.
Yeah.
But she said it wasn't until migrations I started to feel very connected and inspired by the natural world around me. And that's something I don't think will change. I feel an urgency as to, as you say, protect what we're in danger of losing. And the idea can sometimes be overwhelming. I thought that was so interesting because it wasn't like she set out with this agenda. It seemed to emerge really organically while she was writing her first book, which I don't know.
Yeah.
I thought that was fascinating.
It is interesting, right? Because it is a fiction story. And like I said, there's like these other details in it. But, so to know that she was writing from this particular viewpoint, I guess you would call it, or like, just this general interest, but was still able to make it. I guess my point is it's not like she set out to write a nonfiction book about the things that were interesting to her about the natural world, and actually wrote a like page turning novel instead that involved that.
It does sound like this was a real project though, because she did find interviews with farmers in the Scottish Highlands about wolves potentially being brought back. I don't know if it actually happened, but it was at least a discussion at one point.
Yes. So I was looking into this a lot. Of course, like I read this and immediately I'm like, I need to learn more about wolves. I need to learn more about this Yellowstone situation.
It's a great sign. The Yellowstone thing is fascinating. There's a time-lapse video out there of like, just because of the cascade effect of reintroducing wolves, like flowers that hadn't been growing started growing again.
Yeah.
It's like wild.
And so they actually mention the Yellowstone I was going to say experiment, but like, situation in this book, as they point to it as, in saying that, well, they did this in Yellowstone and it was very successful. And so that made me want to look into more what was happening in Scotland. As far as I can tell, like in 2021, an environmental group sort of approached the Scottish government and called them to like agree with this plan of reintroducing wolves. And they were supposed to have I don't know if they were supposed to have a vote or if they just wanted to have a vote, because after that happens, and these articles are from 2021, there isn't really anything that comes after. There
Mm.
is one statement from the Scottish government that says we will not be introducing wolves or lynx or bear or any of these other apex predators that were floated as ideas for, you know, reintroducing or rewilding that area of Scotland. In 2009, they did introduce beavers.
Hmm.
Which is also mentioned in the book, and it was extremely successful, except like that was 2009 and they already have had to like cull the population of beavers and like have governmental intervention because of that population, which adds to the fear about introducing wolves, because if that, you know, you don't want like an overrun population of wolves like roaming around.
Right. Although the wolves would eat the beavers, one would assume.
Yes, right. Like there's that also.
It feels like it's like a self-fulfilling prophecy there. Beavers,
Yeah.
that's so, I guess that makes sense because the damming of the rivers probably changes the environment pretty significantly. That's so interesting. I don't think I've ever thought about beavers having such a wide impact.
No, me neither. And like I said, they do mention Yellowstone like more than one time as sort of their part of their argument for why this would be beneficial for the environment. And on that note, the idea is that if you basically in the book, and I think, you know, in real life also, the issue is with the deer population, and the deer
Oh,
gets so like the populations get so large that they overgraze the like grass areas so that trees cannot actually reach adulthood because they eat them when they are sprouting. And it affects the entire trees
anyone who's tried
growing.
to have a garden in our area
Oh
knows
my gosh,
the plague
I
of deer.
know,
I mean, they're
truly.
just everywhere. And like they're killing themselves because of it, because there's no food, or you know, they cross roads that they should be afraid of. I mean, just deer are just
Yeah,
a plague in this area. So I can only imagine in a still
yeah,
mostly farming community how dangerous they become.
right. And also just like with like logging and everything else and the trees being taken away, any efforts to plant them again is sort of thwarted by these hordes of deer eating them when they are too small to really even become trees to begin with. And the lack of the forest affects the entire ecosystem because animals don't have a place to live. So,
And changes the soil, I'm sure. It's one of those things where you totally understand the farmer's perspective, but at the same time, it's probably impacting them more than anybody else uh,
right.
in a lot of ways. Um, I loved this ending line from the New York Times review. This is a heartfelt and earnest novel. In every chapter, there's evidence of a writer straining for cathedral cadence, the elegiac note of aching significance, but sincerity doesn't guarantee a satisfying read. So I don't think they were pleased with it. I love the
Yeah,
New York Times reviews because it's like, how many SAT words can I squeeze in here?
no, I mean, and I can kind of see where they're coming from. It's very like, you know, nature and forests in particular are sort of touted as like these almost like religious, like I don't even know what to call it. You know, they're just like the importance of them is held in such high esteem, and it's sort of that's like the cornerstone of the entire book, right? Is about the her relationship with the forest and
Right.
um, why she chose this career path and what she's trying to do. And there are some questions that come up in the book about, you know, like how much human intervention is that actually beneficial. Um, but throughout the entire thing, this idea of the forest is very like, I'm lacking a word for it. It's just like of the greatest import.
I have to say though, the way they quoted this line about how Inti describes herself, the main character, and it does make me want to read it. Bad temper Australian who finds it hard to hide contempt and sucks at public speaking.
Yes.
He
So
sounds
actually,
cool.
actually in our book club, we talked about like she's not the most likable character. And you know, we all enjoyed it, even though she is very frustrating in a lot of ways, in my opinion, and in some of the other opinions. But and this is another thing we talked about in our previous podcast about how like sometimes an unlikable character can really ruin the story for certain readers. I found her fascinating, but also very frustrating at times and like confusing about certain choices. But she is very like ornery, but at the same time, she has experienced a lot of hardship in her life. So it sort of explains certain behaviors. There are other behaviors that are not so easily explained, I think, and which left me a little bit wondering about them or their inclusion in the story. But overall, yeah, she's like this very, no nonsense. I'm here to deal with wolves and I don't need friends and I only care about my sister kind of character.
I'm not here to make friends. I'm here to save wolves.
Yeah, basically.
I'm into it. For what it's worth, Kirkus was way nicer and they ended because so if you have never read a Kirkus review, Kirkus is like widely known especially I think among librarians, is like you'll get the most honesty out of a Kirkus review. They tend to be blunt because they're much shorter. They're about 2 paragraphs and they always have a last summation line. And that is the line that makes or breaks whether or not you order the book sometimes.
Yes, 100%.
And the Kirkus one for this was a lovely gripping tale about a world that could be our own, which I think is interesting because it is set in the real world.
Yeah, and it's very recent. I mean, one of our my book club members was talking about something related to the domestic violence, and she's like, "Well, maybe this happened, decades ago." And I was certain that it was very recent because this idea about reintroducing the wolves of Scotland is also very recent. So this book was written in 2021. That's also when that environmental group asked the government to consider this plan, but obviously it had been talked about a lot before they even got to that point. So this is definitely a novel based on like what could happen or what that might look like to actually do this.
So is the trouble with placing the time though, is this one of these literary fiction books that does not mention cell phones, even though it's clearly a time period where people would use cell phones?
No, they absolutely have cell phones.
Okay.
However, there is an issue about lack of service because
Always.
They are in a very remote area. So that does come up sometimes. And it is a little bit, I was reading, I was like, very convenient for you, author, that this wouldn't have service at this moment.
I read a lot of horror, and that's why I was asking, because when you read horror and mystery, cell phones are such a problem for horror and mystery writers because you have to explain why you couldn't just call somebody.
Yeah.
And it's always like, well, the signal was no good. I had dropped my phone. So we're also attached to these like communication machines that we have sitting next to us all the time.
I know.
So it really creates a bit of a plot conundrum if you're trying to build tension, because you're like, why didn't Billy just call someone? You could call someone. Your phone's in your pocket.
Yeah. Or they're like rushing away to some like little corner of the house where they can get 1 bar of service or something like that.
Yeah, they're holding the phone all the way up in the air and like
climbing on the roof.
And also like the fact that your phone gives you like Google.
Yeah.
So, like not having information is also hard to explain.
Yeah.
I don't know how you get around it. I don't blame authors for like finding those kinds of ways to get out of it, but I think especially with mysteries it's really tough. So I'm always curious, like sometimes if things come a little unmoored from time because they just don't mention the phones or they kind of write away the explanation, because that to me is such a marker of a modern book, is everybody's running around with their phones.
Yeah, no, they're definitely included. They just conveniently don't work well in certain plot scenarios.
Dude's ex cell phone. So did you have any last thoughts from your group or that you wanted to share about the book? I didn't ask.
Not in particular. Like I said, I really enjoyed it. I do find it a bit of a page turner because there is this like mystery undertone to it. It's very focused on relationships of all kinds. So, like relationships with animals or relationships with the environment, relationships with other people is like a whole subset too. So, I think there's a lot in here for different types of readers, and I found it very interesting. It did remind me of actually a nonfiction book that I had read. So, if you were interested in the environmental aspect of it, there is this book that I read that I loved. It's called The Sun is a Compass by Caroline Van Hemert. And this book, I mean, it's different, but basically she's an ornithologist and she travels 4,000 miles with her husband in the Alaskan wilderness to study the birds and like make this journey. And there's a lot of really great descriptions about the Alaskan landscape and about bird behavior, which sounds like very boring and weird, but it's really lovely. And it's also kind of an adventure story. So it's a little bit, different in a lot of ways. It's obviously nonfiction, but this idea of having a main character or person who is like interested in this and like undergoes something difficult to try to learn more about them is similar.
That's great. So you had a 2-for-1 recommendation today. I love it. So I'll just say thank you so much, Dana. As always, lovely to talk to you.
I love talking about chapters.
Yeah, we're extending the book club experience into the next day, right?
Yes.
And thank you for listening, and we look forward to talking to you in 2 weeks' time. Remember, if you want to find out more about New City Library, you can find us at newcitylibrary.org.